What's good, YouTube? It's Chimera Squid back in another Squid video. So, following up to yesterday's video about the Chimera guide, where we kind of talked about the deck recipe, well, let's kind of do some of the plays, go over some hands, talk about like sequencing, talk about how we should play the deck, how we can best play around hand trap. Starting off with the Mirror Sword generic combo, just showing you guys how this works for those of you guys that don't know, but I'm sure everyone's already seen this. But it does have some value to actually watch this, so we know exactly how we want to sequence things and how we want to position our monsters. So obviously going into our Gazelle, adding the Chimera Fusion off the Baphomet, fusing these off into the Phantom. And now here's where I see a lot of people putting this in attack mode, but in my opinion, you should definitely put everything in defense mode when you can possibly do that, this format, because one, purely can OTK you with happiness. Two, in the mirror match, they can OTK you with the Big Daddy Chimera, right? The one that attacks multiple times. So we don't want to put anything in attack mode. The 2100 versus 1800 literally does not matter in this current format. There are no monsters that are like 2K or 1900 attack that actually matter to trade off with Chimera the King of Phantom Beasts, other than in the mirror match where they can attack it over with the same copy of the card. But again, we want to play safe, so we don't want to put these guys in attack mode, okay? Okay, now chain links. Doesn't really matter what you order in the graveyard. You can chain link 1, Baphomet, chain link 2, Gazelle, and then chain link 3, Chimera generally, because this way it just has padding. You know, we can play around things like Ghost Spell, just for a good measure. Going to be able to add a copy of Koado. If we already searched Koado, then we just add another copy of Mirror Sword Knight. If Koado's already been ditched, to add the Mirror Sword Knight initially. And then we are going to be able to summon back. So this should always be in defense mode. Your illusions should always be in defense mode because they cannot be destroyed by battle. So it does not matter if they're in attack or defense. So you should never put them in attack mode because you're just taking unnecessary damage, right? So definitely put them in defense mode. Even though it has 300 defense, like our instinct is just to put it in attack mode, but always put this in defense mode. Then from there, Chimera Fusion comes back to the hand, and this is just a standard combo, okay? So we set the Chimera Fusion, and then we pass for turn. And then from there, always in our opponent's turn, what we want to do is use this in draw phase, because if they happen to draw a Droll Knockbird, then they could actually draw us in the standby phase or on the main phase in their turn, which means that we're not going to be able to activate Guardian Chimera, because Guardian Chimera has to be able to draw in order to pop, right? So it's all one effect. So definitely do this in the draw step where the Droll cannot be activated, and then from there just going again into the Baphomet in defense mode and just having your resources all set up for the consecutive turn, and also having more cards to fuse with the Chimera Fusion. So yeah, really cool first line there. Let's talk a little bit about sequencing. Okay, anytime you have Branded Fusion and Mirror Sword Knight, obviously you want to prioritize the Branded Fusion, especially going first, because this checks for a lot of hand traps. It checks for basically every hand trap except for Droll Knockbird. It could potentially check for Ash or not check for Ash if people are actually holding the Ash for the Mirror Sword Knight. But in real life scenarios, you can always make a read on your opponent as well. If they're like thinking, they're always going to think on a Random Fusion 9 times out of 10 if they have an Ash, unless they're like super big brained and they're just so experienced with the deck that they know for a fact that they're holding the Ash Blossom for your Mirror Sword Knight, and they're just like, okay. Like 9 times out of 10, someone's going to be thinking when I activate Random Fusion. If they have Ash, they're going to be like thinking, right? So being able to make that read there is really valuable, and it just checks for every hand trap. So we're just going to go ahead and do this. By checking for every hand trap, I mean, game 1, it depends on what game you're in. If you're in game 2, then I definitely would prefer sending a Mirror Sword Knight for the light for Albion. However, if you're in game 1, then what you can actually do, this is ignoring Versago for now, that we're not playing Dragoon, I would just send an Effect Veiler, because then they don't know where we're playing for sure. We could still have the chance of playing a deck like Labyrinth, or even potentially Eldritch maybe, just teching in Branded Fusion, right? So this makes sure that they don't know we're playing Chimera, so they might like use the Veiler or the Imperm on this Albion instead of holding it for the Baphomet. So this is just like how I like to sequence things, and then from here just going directly into the Mirror Jade. Everything in defense mode. Again, we have to be really safe about like an Imperm or a Veiler and then leaving our monster in attack, and it becomes volatile to getting OTK'd. So everything in defense mode here. And I generally like this play, especially in this deck, because it has a follow-up where you can send the Albalanitis to search for another copy of Fusion Destiny. So that's why I really like that play. If we're actually playing the Dragoon as well, alternatively, you could have sent Versago or Light Hex Sealed Fusion and then just gone to Dragoon. So if they were holding the Ash, then the Dragoon just has to negate there, right? But the reason why I like doing Branded Fusion first is it always checks for something. It always gives you valuable information just based on reading your opponent, as well as any hand traps they might have. They would have Impermed or Veilered the Albion potentially, or they would have Ash there. So basically checks for a lot of things all rolled up in one card. Now, the times where you would actually use Branded Fusion after might be in the rare scenario in a late to mid game where you have the opportunity of actually OTKing them with a Branded Fusion, going into something like a Albion and then banishing a bunch of illusions as well as the big Chimera, the mythical beast, to go into the Chimera, the illusion beast, and then just attack multiple times per game, right? So that might be a time that we actually prioritize the Sword Knight or our other plays before Branded Fusion. But generally, I like to lead with Branded Fusion because it checks for all of those options before we have the opportunity to go into Mirror Sword Knight. And most of the time, if they don't have any interruptions for Branded Fusion, then this Mirror Sword Knight will go through all unimpeded. So that's why I definitely like to lead with this card. Okay, now talking about scenario with Pot of Prosperity. For those of you guys that are running this card, it's really, really powerful in this deck because you can dig for basically anything, all of your one-card starters. Which one should you do first, Pot of Prosperity or Mirror Sword Knight, right? There are a couple of cards that we have to consider, namely Ash and namely Droll and Lockbird. If we lead with Pot of Prosperity, that means they Droll, then we're not resolving Mirror Sword Knight, but there's also a chance that they can Ash the pot. Because if in a blind game situation where someone's potting for 6, like, basically, everyone's going to Ash. Like, I'm going to Ash that because if there's a chance that you're playing Kashtira and you brick, then I'm definitely getting a lot of value out of that, right? So if I don't know what you're playing, I'm totally Ashing that. So there's a chance we can bait the Ash and then resolve the Mirror Sword Knight. But unfortunately, we get punished a lot harder with Droll. Like in this build, we're probably digging for a fusion spell, but then this still means we're not resolving the Mirror Sword Knight. We're only using one card to the maximum value. So I feel like actually using Mirror Sword Knight is the best option here because if we play into Ash, that's fine. We can still Pot of Prosperity for a fusion spell. And if we play into Droll, we're going to get the Baphomet on the table to add the fusion spell as well as the Gazelle. So that means even if they Droll there, we already have the options to go into our Chimera combo. So we're still ripping a card and we're still getting a bunch of resources into our combo. So that's why I feel like it's a little better personally, but it definitely depends on the rest of your hand as well. If you have like a lot of hand traps and you feel like you would rather dig for those, or in the game 2 and game 3 where we're playing crossout and for some reason the Power of Prosperity wasn't sided out in that matchup, then we might pros for the crossout first just so we can guarantee to resolve through Ash and potentially have the crossout for Droll if we sided that in as well. So it really depends on the hand, but generally in like a blind game state, I might just start with the Mirror Sword Knight just to see what happens before using the Pot of Prosperity. But obviously this would change if we had something like a Branded Fusion, then we might just activate that first to check for the other hand traps before using Pot of Prosperity or Mirror Sword Knight. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about sequencing with the hands. If you had a hand like this and you were going first, which one would you lead off with, right? It's a little bit of a trap. Like, a lot of people would probably just try and jam the Mirror Sword Knight and hope that they survive the onslaught of Ash. But unfortunately, if we do get Ash here, we probably just lose on the spot, right? Because if they Ash, we don't have a body on the board to fuse with, so we're not getting into Chimera. So in my opinion, I think it's always good to play safe in Yu-Gi-Oh! You should always play conservative. You should always play around the maximum number of hand traps as you can possibly can, while still giving yourself a chance. So in my opinion, I would rather just summon the Gazelle. Because if they Ash here, that's fine. We have the Chimera fusion, so we can set it and pass, and then we have the ability to actually make a Guardian Chimera using Gazelle and 2 monsters in our hand on their turn. So even through hand traps, we're still guaranteed to have some sort of push, right? We can potentially make a Guardian Chimera, pop a card, and then search, and also have a chance at drawing 2 more hand traps, which is really, really important, especially against certain matchups. Whereas if we got Ash directly on the Mirror Sword Knight there, then you just lose the game. Because like, we're not doing anything with the Chimera fusion, right? There's nothing we can really fuse into with those cards. It's just game over from that point on, and we're just passing with nothing. So you should always be playing safe with this deck. With decks in general and Yu-Gi-Oh! Specifically, if your play is still weaker than what it would have been, it's still good to have the opportunity to play safe so you account for the times where they do have the interruption and you don't auto lose on the spot, right? You don't want to high roll all the time unless you absolutely have to. Now, in the chance where this does resolve, what we're going to do is just add the Baphomet instead. So you can see that our combo is going to be a lot weaker. We're not actually going to have access to Mirror Sword Knight immediately in the graveyard because we didn't tribute it off. So instead, we are still going to be able to get the combo, but Baphomet's also not going to be able to bring anything back. So that means we're not going to have follow-up on their turn. We're only going to be able to get the effect of Gazelle and the effect of Chimera. But again, this is still way safer than playing strictly into the Ash, in my opinion. We're still going to be able to add a copy of Coatl. We can Foolish that to add another copy of a monster. In this case, we have double Mirror Sword Knight, so it's probably just better to get a Gazelle, but it depends on your hand. If we didn't have the Mirror Sword Knights, we could just add another copy of the Mirror Sword Knight. Obviously, having different monster names, so we can make the Guardian Chimera, which requires different names. So in this scenario here, what do we have? If we resolve this, we rip a card out of their hand. We have the Coatl. Unfortunately, no Mirror Sword Knight, but we have a rip. We have the Guardian Chimera play or Magnum using Chimera Fusion, and then we have Recursion with Chimera, the Branded Beast. So in our end phase, instead of using the Mirror Sword Knight to bring it back, we could just use the Chimera to bring back the Baphomet, so we still have the same follow-up, and this is just way safer playing. So again, just like think of ways to play safe. If you guys are going to a big tournament, you definitely have to consider all these options. You have to play extremely clean and account for everything. Don't just high roll and say, oh, if he has it, he has it. Think in a way that you can actually play around these cards, because this actually matters, especially at the higher levels. All right, let's talk about mind games for a second. This is a concept that's not specific for this deck, but rather applies for the entirety of Yu-Gi-Oh! So let's say that this is game 2. Our opponent knows we're playing Branded Chimera, and they have an Ash Blossom and maybe like an Effect Failure or something, but they're probably going to Ash Blossom the Branded Fusion, or maybe hold it for Sword Knight, but let's say there's a good chance that they're going to potentially use it on the Branded Fusion, and we have an awful hand like this where we really need to push through the Branded Fusion, right? We really need this to resolve. If we go Branded Fusion, they Ash, it really hurts, because whatever we dig off Prost might just get Veilered or whatever. So Prost is like a lot lower impact, also because the fact that we have multiple dead copies in our hand. So what we can actually do is, instead of activating Branded Fusion as our first action, or Pot of Prosperity as our first action, you could potentially try Mind Gaming, where we set our entire hand and then Prost. Especially if our opponent thinks that we're quite bad at the game, like we're a new beginner player. If we played in a way that doesn't really make it obvious that we're a really well-known or like successful good player, then they might call our bluff and think that we're a noob, and they might be like, oh, this person just bricked, and they set their entire hand, so we're going to Ash the Pot of Prosperity. Like, it looks a lot more enticing that you would Ash the Pot of Prosperity now, right? Because we set 3 cards that are effectively blanks, and if you have an Ash and we only have 1 card in hand, you're going to want to Ash this Pot of Prosperity, right? Whereas if we led with Branded Fusion here, you're probably going to Ash that, because we have like 4 cards in hand, and Branded Fusion is like a really powerful card. If we led with Pot of Prosperity there with 5 cards in our hand, you're probably not going to Ash that, because you know we're on Branded Chimera and we have other cards in hand, right? So here, it kind of gives that illusion of us bricking where they might Ash that. And if they Ash that, that's good, because now we're full combo with Branded Fusion. We can go Rinbrum, we can go into our combo, we can start our combo off, right? So this is just like little things to influence your opponent, to give them the false sense that we're actually in a worse position than we actually are, or to give them the illusion of potentially interacting with a card, like, you know, like sort of influencing them there based on the previous play that we made. And it's just really something that's cool, I think, to give that, just like, mind games exist in Yu-Gi-Oh! For a reason, so I think this is just really something that's really cool that you can do. And then lastly, really quick, I want to talk to you guys about the OTK with our Big Daddy Chimera, the Illusion Beast. So this is a really cool card that attacks a number of times equal to the materials used for it, and you require Chimera the Flying Mythical Beast plus 1 or more illusion monsters. Obviously, any monster it attacks cannot be destroyed by battle, and the first time he attacks, after damage calculation, you make that opposing monster's attack to 0, negate its effects, and then you can continue attacking into that 0 attack as a free portal into their life points directly, right? So that's generally how you OTK. Now, off 1 Mirror Sword Knight is not quite OTK, but we're just going to demonstrate how this comes into play. Basically, this allows you to build a Chimera for 3 attacks, just off this standard line combo, just off the 1 Mirror Sword Knight, because what you do is you obviously activate, you go into your standard combo, you go into the regular Chimera, and then the effect of Gazelle and Baphomet will trigger, so this comes back, and then you also search the other illusion. So now you guys see that we already have 3 materials for that actual fusion, which means that we're able to fuse for it by adding back Chimera Fusion with 3 attacks. So what does that mean? Well, anytime your opponent has a monster with 1300 or less attack, that's game with this 3 monster materials. Because what does that do is 31 on your first attack, 3100 minus 1300, okay? So that's 1800. So that puts your opponent at 62. You activate the effect to put their attack to 0, and then we attack twice for 31 plus 31, which is 62. So 1300 or less attack on a monster is 8k exact or more, right? So that's just one thing to consider. If your opponent has like a 1300 or less attack monster on the board in attack mode, it's just game off the 1 card. If at the beginning of our combo we actually had another illusion in our hand, then that's just game. Because after we do our combo and we have the additional illusion in our hand, we just fuse with 4 materials, so he can attack 4 times, right? So it doesn't matter, as long as your opponent has anything in attack mode, it doesn't matter. It could be like a 10,000 attack monster, as long as we're able to survive whatever damage we take from that. We make it 0 on the first attack, and then we attack 3 times with 31, so that's 93, right? 31, 31, 31. So that's just game. So that's one thing to consider. And then the last really cool thing is if we have Branded Fusion and it's mid to late game and we have a bunch of illusions as well as the big Chimera, the Phantom Beast King in our graveyard, this is one thing to note as well. If you already have Branded Fusion in hand and it's our opponent's end phase and we might not want to use the Chimera right away because we do want to take advantage of that being in the graveyard, then you could just use the Branded Fusion to fuse off into an Albion. And then from there, that will actually allow you to build a big Chimera with multiple attacks because you're able to banish from the graveyard to summon him because he happens to be summonable off of Albion the Branded Dragon, right? So just banishing obviously all of our illusions, and then he gains the attack for the fusion monsters that were used as material, so he can hack a plethora of times. It's really something that's cool. You can also do it with the Lubellion as well, because this guy's level 8 or lower, so it's perfect. So this is also OTK. Also, the nice thing about Albion is he can actually attack after using the effect, unlike Lubellion. So that's just one thing to consider when going into these plays. Albion is a lot better for going into the OTK. And yeah, this is just wanted to show you guys with the OTK, you can catch them really off guard. With Nibiru, it's really, really handy as well, because if you put the token into attack mode, that could potentially guarantee that you have game. Anytime, if you only have the 3 fusion monsters material, like the 3 with their standard play, and we have any other monster to deal the remaining damage, right? Because this is 62 guaranteed, right? So they're going to be at 1800. So we just need a monster with 1800 or more attack to deal the rest of the damage to make their life points 0. So Nib would definitely do that with the token in attack position. Just remember to attack first and all of your attacks with Chimera the Illusion Beast before dealing the game shot with your other monster, because your other monster will be able to destroy that monster by battle, whereas this illusion monster cannot, which is how we do the multiple attacks to deal the damage. So just remember that. And this is just why Nib is really, really interesting with the additional body to be able to do that, as well as giving them an attack position monster. You could also do this with Radiant and the Kaiju as well, as long as we have another monster with 1800 more attack, or an illusion beast that attacks 4 times, or the Branded Fusion play. It's just game. It's a really cheesy way to get for game. So it's really, really cool. I definitely suggest that you guys keep this in the back of your head for OTK plays. It's also really cool to note that with Branded Fusion, if you are playing the substitute fusion monsters like Light Hex Sealed Fusion or VERSAGO, you don't even need the Chimera in the graveyard, because you can just activate Branded Fusion immediately and then dump Albaz plus whatever VERSAGO or the Light Hex Sealed Fusion, and then from there you can go instantly into something like an Albion or a Lubellion, whichever, and use the effect to banish or return back the VERSAGO, treating it as a big Phantom Chimera, which substitutes for that name, and then banish the illusion, so you are able to go directly into a 1-card OTK using Branded Fusion, provided you have the other illusions in your graveyard. So that's just another really, really cool thing that you can do with either VERSAGO or Light Hex Sealed Fusion or Goddess of Whim. Whatever fusion substitute you're using, you can actually do that directly. So that's just one thing to mention as well. That's about it for the video. If you guys have any other tips that we missed in this video, definitely let us know. For all of you Chimera enthusiasts, let us know in the comments below. And I'll see you guys in the next video.